This section looks at how the exam boards have responded to the requirements for speaking for the GCSE French 2024. First of all, what about the preparation? When the students go into a preparation room, what are they allowed to do? Well, for AQA and Edexcel, you're allowed to write anything you like, sentences, in notes. The draft of EduCAS is single words only. How much can you write? It's restricted for Edexcel to one side of A4. You can write as many notes as much as you like for AQA. Edexcel allows students to annotate the card itself. AQA doesn't. Reading aloud, can you practice that beforehand? Well, for Edexcel, they allow for 1 minute at the start of the test when the recording has started, where students are allowed to try things out if they want to, or they can choose not to. For AQA, they don't have that, but within the exam itself, they do allow more than one attempt at saying it. So a student could say something aloud, decide to correct themselves, and the most recent correction would be the one that would count. Then for the order of tasks, for Edexcel, the reading aloud is the very first exercise you do. For the role play, for AQA, the first one is the role play. I'm not sure that's going to make much difference. I think I can see that for the Edexcel, the idea is, I suppose, that because they're expecting the student to be practicing their reading aloud in that 1 minute at the start of the test, they probably think therefore it's more logical they then start with the actual reading aloud, which is followed by questions. With the AQA, I think there may be that the role play is the one that they've prepared where they don't have to listen to the examiner saying anything, so that could be seen as really the most straightforward task, whereas the reading aloud is followed by the 4 questions where they have to start speaking. So if you like, the question answer bit of the reading aloud and the picture task follow on from each other. First of all then, the role play. What are the variables? I'll be showing you examples of this, but in summary, a particular variable is what the nature of the role play is. So for Edexcel, you have defined formal transactional contexts, which will be different from the picture card themes, obviously. So the Edexcel has 10 role play settings and finite functions. That is opposed to AQA, where you have defined social contexts, and it will be the same themes as for the picture card, so it's as now. At the moment, the EduCAS draft has undefined contexts, so it could be anything. How many questions does the student have to ask? So at the moment, that's with AQA, it's 1 question for both the foundation and the higher, and for the Edexcel, you have 1 in the foundation, but you have to ask 2 questions in the higher. When you look at it, you might think that some are authentic tasks and some are quite stilted. You decide. Look at the instructions as well. You can see the set of the role plays, and you can think, well, is it something where the students will be familiar when they look at it? They'll know what sort of thing to expect. Then I think very helpful for teachers in particular is to see a detailed exemplification of the role plays, so you can see what would be expected to get certain marks. That way you can communicate to the students. So have a look at what they offer. Here's the AQA role play at foundation. If you do AQA, you'll see it's very similar to what you have at the moment. A social setting where the examiner will use 2, it's informal, and it'll cover the same same topics and themes as you might have for the read aloud questions and for the picture questions. So there you've got 5 bullet points, and of those, 1 of them is a question. Here are the criteria. It's marked merely on communication, AO2. It hasn't got any AO3 element, which is the grammar. And on the next page, you'll see the exemplification. So for every one of the role plays, if you go to the appendix, you've got how something would be marked. So it's not a generic one, it's particularly for that role play. And you're given how somebody can get 2 marks, how they would get 1 mark, what does it mean if it's partially conveyed or has some ambiguity. So you can see it's often to do with, well, there without an accurate verb, So although this doesn't include grammar, it is communication, if you're going to communicate, you do need the verb. And then they'll tell you what it is if it really isn't sufficient. Here's the Edexcel. Here it's transactional, so you'll be hearing the examiner using vous. The students do not have to use vous. They will not be penalised if they use tu. So this will be separate from what you'll be preparing for the read aloud question and answer and the picture card question and answer. It's something which I'm sure people cover though anyway, don't they? We throughout the course we'll be doing transactional, and it's really helpful to be able to know how to do these things. It'll be up to you as to whether or not you particularly would like that to be part of the assessment itself. So here the situation, you're in a hotel in Switzerland, so it's set in a cultural context, and here again you've got 5 things that you have to do, of which one of them is a question. So describe, say, give your opinion, ask a question. So you can then have a look here, very similar. Describe, say, give an opinion, ask a question. The criteria, again, all to do with communication. Oh, no, actually, I started saying that, and I'm not going to stop the audio to redo that, just to say, look, this is AO1. So AO1 is response to spoken language. Now, in fact, the students will prepare this. They don't have to understand anything that the examiner says. That won't change anything they say. Originally, Edexcel did put this as being AO2, which is correct. That's what you've got for the AQA. It's AO2. That is correct. AQA originally had it down as AO1, which is incorrect because that's interaction. It's having to respond to what you hear. But they were told to put it back to AO2. So it's really odd here that AQA had it wrong, had it corrected, and now that's correct. Edexcel had it right, we're told to correct it to AO1. In the end, when you look at the assessment objectives, you might feel this really doesn't make that much difference, I suppose, because they have to balance out somewhere. But it's rather curious. I suppose you could say in some ways it means that for Edexcel they are getting credit for an element which we might see as being more demanding. Having to respond to what somebody has said to you could be seen as being more demanding than having to present something which you're in control of. For the Edexcel you get exemplification for one role play only. So there's the detail, and it's giving the principles as to what it is that would get you the marks. I'm sure that when it comes to the marking itself, when it comes to the real thing, as with all boards, they'll always have something whereby examiners will have a forum whereby they would be able to decide at that point what are we going to accept, what aren't we going to accept. But I think it's ever so useful to have as much help as possible at this stage as a teacher to be able to prepare students, so you can be quite confident about saying that would get a mark, no, that wouldn't get a mark, and it's the exam board which has said that. That's not just me being fussy. So the more exemplification the better, really. And it's good that you have exemplification in these specifications for all of them. What about the role play for hire? Well, here, same thing, 5 bullet points, still just one question for AQA. And here you can see a little bit more is asked for, so it's not just one detail. You've got give one type of film and one reason. 2 details, 2 details. The advantage, that's always a bit more difficult. It's normally a bit more difficult because an advantage often is to say and why it's an advantage, why is it good. But still you only just got one question. Criteria the same as for foundation. Again, you have exemplification for each role play, and I feel that this is quite reassuring when you look at it. So the type you prefer and why, that's the standard thing we often teach people, isn't it? Favourite, so that's where you've got to set the preferred, or you can just say I like so and so, she is great. 2 things, any 2 verbs in the past tense there. Earlier I just said, it's a bit more demanding to give an advantage because you've got to have 2 sentences. Actually here, look, no, it is, you could have just said, it's good for your health, it's fun. And then the questions, it's making it clear that the question can be one was formed with a who, what, why, or whatever with a verb, qu'est-ce que tu fais, what do you do, or it's fine to do, and this is in the specification, that you're expected to be able to know how to ask a question by rising intonation. Then you've got the examples for what it means to have partially done it, and I noticed that for something you did in your free time last week, you do get 1 mark if you got 2 details even without the accurate verb, because I suppose the idea is that they know what the context is. The examiner has said, what did you do last week? So there is a communication there. So it's basically again to do with, if it's not an accurate verb but it communicates, you'll be getting the 1 mark. And then you've got what it is for no marks. Here it is for the role play Edexcel. As with the foundation, it's still in a formal setting, so you're in a tourist information. It requires you to ask 2 questions, and there are the criteria. I've noticed, actually, I think this is a good thing, isn't it, that as well as telling you this is what the exercise is, it's also a reminder of what the quality is meant to be. So a few words, 1-word answers will not be sufficient to gain full marks. So as teachers, often we're reminding people, aren't we, and it's quite good to give that little prompt just beforehand. Here are the criteria for the role play for Edexcel. You have 1 exemplification. So this particular one has been selected to demonstrate a possible range of performances, and then you would apply that to the others. When I look at it, I think the main difference here is that whereas with AQA it's pretty standard that the definition of some ambiguity was if the verb form was incorrect. Whereas here, in the examples they give, they'll say despite the incorrect verb form, the response is fully communicated. So in answer to the question, hello, can I help you? If someone said, je cherchais une banque, to look for a bank, the idea is that the response would be fully communicated, and therefore they would get 2 marks. That gets then the same mark if you said, je voudrais un plan de la ville. So that's fully communicated, no ambiguity at all. So those 2 would get the same mark. There's another example of here. What are you going to do tomorrow? Tomorrow, to go to the castle. The idea is that's fully communicated, and it would get exactly the same marks as someone saying, I am going to swim in the swimming pool. So they've given examples where the verb is incorrect and yet you'd still get the full marks. They've also given examples where word order, even if the word order is incorrect or they've missed out an article 1, they would still get full marks. And obviously this is for you to reflect on whether you want to have something where you feel, yep, communication is the most important thing, they'd get the full marks, or whether you feel that this is an element which could be a discriminator between candidates and therefore perhaps lead to a fairer rank order of students. Now let's look at the speaking, the read aloud. Here are the general variables that you might get, the appearance of it, the layout of it, whether it's as a line or as a paragraph, how many times you're attempted to read it aloud during the test itself. So it's explicit that in AQA students are allowed to stop and correct themselves. The number of unseen follow-up questions, so you have 4 for AQA and just 2 for Edexcel. But looking ahead, when it comes to the picture card, AQA doesn't have any unseen questions and Edexcel has 2. So in the end, for both AQA and Edexcel, the students are going to have 4 unseen questions which are scripted for the teacher. The others, the teachers will decide. Let's look at the passage itself. Here for AQA, you've got 5 clear sentences. I think when you look at it, certainly I feel that those sentences are very familiar. They're ones which we would do now, typically, at Key Stage 3 as well. And the students are told that afterwards you'll be asked 4 questions in French that relate to that topic. And yet, I think this is good that they are told to answer them as fully as you can. A reminder about the process for getting the best marks. Look at the criteria. Here, as I've mentioned before, the reading aloud of the text, if students self-correct their pronunciation of a word or words, it's the final corrected version that's assessed. And if students restart the reading aloud task, it's the final attempt which is marked. So although we haven't got the allowance with Edexcel where you're allowed to practice for a minute before the test begins, here you are allowed to repeat it. And something perhaps I should have mentioned earlier on is that now with the speaking task, it's the overall length which has a maximum. It's not a maximum per task. So if you were to spend longer on this, then do make sure that for the other tests you're giving students enough time to be able to show what they can do. Look at the criteria where, again, encouraging, I feel that it's not expecting perfection here. There may be minor errors and a few major errors in pronunciation. And down here, a definition of that major adversity affects communication, minor doesn't affect communication. And afterwards you have some guidance which will really list what are the main things where people get things wrong, really. Helpfully, that's divided into major errors and minor errors. And they would see as minor the fact that IN, for example, is pronounced as an English word, intéressant, rather than intéressant. And if you can't get that R sound of the R, you're not going to be penalised for that. That's seen as minor. So what about the Edexcel Read Aloud? Again, you've got 5 sentences very clearly laid out. They are told that they'll be asked 2 questions relating to what they've read. So it's not specific as it is with the AQA signalling it is this particular topic that you're going to have of education and work, but students will definitely, you'll have trained them, won't you, to say there'll be questions to do with that particular topic. They're also reminded how to get the full marks. Looking at the criteria, really it's the same as the AQA, isn't it, of pronunciation being clear, and message as well comes into it. The lapses have little or no impact on the messages, and I think helpful that it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. They particularly mention the sound spelling correspondences, whereas AQA doesn't mention it, but clearly it is to do with that because AQA has put it into the AO3 as well. Here the way that they've exemplified it is to say, let's take one of the texts, transcribe what a typical mispronunciation might be and why that impacts on the message. So why is that something which would be seen as impacting the message? So whereas with the AQA you had, if you like, generic, these are the sorts of things which you could apply to any text. Here you've got a text itself to say this is what would happen, but they've just got one like that. I'm interested, they also stress that an anglicised accent will not impact on success. AQA doesn't say that, but I presume that if they can put across the message, and people can put across a message even with an English accent, that doesn't affect them. So they haven't got the word, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one here. Here it's pronunciation, nothing to do with intonation. Okay. What I've done here, I couldn't resist it, because I think with this being the new exam which is coming up and people are quite concerned about it, I'm sure this is what we're all going to do. We'll say, well, let's look at what the exam boards are requiring now and backwards take from that what will be our main bits of advice as far as preparing for an exam is concerned. So there you've got the marking guidance from AQA, the marking guidance from Edexcel. And I've put here, I think, the really good news that both are focusing on this communication. How does it impact on communication? It isn't purely the knowledge of the sound spelling correspondence. And here could be perhaps the list. It can be because of the way you pronounce it. If you pronounce it and it's a totally different word, you're not going to get credit for it. If you pronounce it and it actually just cannot be understood, then you won't get anything. And then here, and this is particularly drawing on the AQA one, what are the common errors which an Anglophone would make? So the consonants, being whether it's a soft or hard, not pronouncing that as qu, whether the S is a z or a s. Vowels always, whether it's e, e. Endings of non-verbs, so not pronouncing the S at the end. And then this very common one, verb endings, which even when I find even with sixth form, I'm really stressing ENT, don't pronounce the ENT. So the non-pronunciation of that, but then the difference between E and sometimes not pronouncing that. And also pronouncing cognates, cognates with an English pronunciation. If there's a cognate and they pronounce it as an English person would, a French person might not understand it. Now let's look at the questions which follow the read aloud section. For AQA there are 4 unseen questions. There they are. You'll find when you look at the texts that people couldn't just lift things from the text. So that's where there's no problem about them still having their notes relating to that or the text itself. So here, where's your school? Tell me about your favourite subject. When do you do your homework? What do you think of your uniform? And this seems to be the pattern for all of them, that you'll have 2 closed questions, where and when, 1 open one, tell me about, and 1 opinion one, what do you think of? That's quite typical, and it's the present tense. This part has got a recommended length. I won't keep on repeating this, just to say that for all of the things to do with speaking, you don't have to stick to a minimum, but there's an overall maximum for the whole test. Looking at the criteria, we're familiar with this, a holistic table, but it does make it a little bit clearer as to what it expects. So here, all questions answered, at least 3, at least 2, at least 2. And then these words which are used: extended and developed well, develop minimally. The really helpful thing there is that you have definitions of what does it mean to answer clearly, understandably. What is an extended, developed well, developed minimally? So here, for example, for an extended response, it's one where you've got 3 verbs in the answer. Develop well, you've got two clauses. Develop minimally, it's where you've just got a piece of information, which could be in the form of a noun or an adjective. So that sort of information means that it's much more straightforward to be able to prepare students for getting marks. You can tell them what is expected. And within the mark scheme, you have a bit more information there to explain what the situation is. I'm sure this is the level of detail which examiners would have had before when they're having their meetings or when they're preparing to make sure that there's a fair application of the mark scheme, but it's so useful that now we as teachers have that information as well. Here are the Edexcel read aloud 2 unseen questions. Remembering they'll have 2 unseen for the picture card later on. The examiner has to take the stimulus material from the candidates, otherwise they would be able to just lift answers from there. So here are the 2 questions. They always sort of follow the same pattern. It's always what do you like plus infinitive, or what do you like in the way of, comme, and what do you think of. Here is the criteria. For here it's not holistic, it's per question. They'll get 2 marks and it's AO1, so it's in responding to that spoken language, which is correct. And then what does it mean, fully communicate, partially communicate, and ambiguity? Well, again, as with AQA and elsewhere in the specification, there is clarification as to what that actually means. So what they've done is to take one example and say what would get 2 marks, what would get 1 mark. And I think that's really helpful. That's done just for one of them, but you can then apply that to others. I don't think this looks quite as demanding as the criteria you have for AQA, but that's where you're going to have to look overall over the whole of the speaking element. At which points are the exam boards looking for something which is really going to discriminate your grades, in this case for the foundation grades going up to 5, because obviously somewhere you need somewhere where you're going to be getting that discrimination. Here's the read aloud for higher. Looking at the text there, you can see it's nice and clearly set out in sentences. When I looked at all of them, they follow a similar pattern of having, there'll be 3 tenses there, although the actual questions which are asked are all in the present tense. Again, as with foundation, there's a pattern to the type of questions which are asked. You'll always have one which is a closed type one, like this one, what is your favourite day in school? The vast majority have the construction of what do you think of, or there'll be something similar which is asking for a simple opinion. But a difference from the foundation is that you'll have more questions which are open-ended, like this tell me about and what is your opinion of, where normally you would have to expand it a little bit more. The criteria are the same as for the foundation. And then the read aloud higher, again you have very, very clear text there. None of the texts in the SAMs include anything other than the present tense. Presumably that may well help when it comes to the follow-on questions, which are also always in the present tense, so there wouldn't be a confusion there. The questions themselves always follow a pattern of, the second one is always what is your opinion on, plus a noun, and the first one, there's a variety of question types, but it's always to do with liking. How do you like to do something? So this emphasis on what does the student will be able to talk about themselves. But when I looked through it, there were some which I felt were a bit more demanding than others. I always think a common question, how do you like to celebrate, is a bit more demanding than do you like something. Remember, they won't have access to that text when they answer the questions. They have to hand that in. I'm very conscious as I'm looking through this that this does really come across as a much simpler format and less demanding than the AQA. I'm just thinking it is the first task which they have in the speaking test, whereas for the AQA it's the second task. That may be part of their thinking. I think, again, I can't stress enough how you have to look overall and decide, is this specification in the end going to discriminate? Even if this particular exercise might not be one that you think is going to discriminate as much, to get those differences between the 6, 7, 8, 9, there may be others which do. The final part of the speaking exam for both AQA and Edexcel is the photo description and conversation. So what are the variables? First of all, the choice of theme. AQA has 3 themes, Educas has 6 themes. For Educas, 2 weeks ahead of the exam, they will have it so that each candidate is given 2 of those 6 themes, and they can choose one of those and know that that's the one that's going to come up. So it means that they can't spend the whole of year 10 and 11 just concentrating on one theme, but there will be some element of feeling, yeah, I do know what sort of thing is going to come up when it comes to the picture card. With AQA, there are only 3 themes within which there are several topics. The students won't know which of those is going to come up for the picture card, but I suppose overall, as is now with AQA, they do know that those 2 of the 3 themes will be covered through question and answer, whether it's with the read aloud follow-up or the photo card. So basically all of the students are going to have to prepare all the themes, aren't they, for the speaking and for the writing. But that does make Edexcel different in just refining it a little bit. As far as the nature of the text and the picture stimulus, AQA provide 2 photos and the students have to address both, but they don't have to be equal coverage, so you can just say one sentence about one of them and then concentrate on the other photo. Edexcel gives 2 photos and you can choose one of them. For both of them then, it does mean that there is an element where you can choose what you want to focus on when you're speaking about a photograph. And then as far as colour, Edexcel have it in colour and it's in black and white for AQA. AQA does, however, make the point that you can make reference to colour if you want. You won't be penalised if it's not the colour that was there in the original. But it's something that can perhaps look a little bit more attractive. One of the reasons that AQA give for not having colour, frankly, is to do with cost, because obviously it does make it much more expensive to produce. They are a charity, and then you as a school will decide whether or not anyway you'd like to practice in black and white or in colour, whichever one that you choose. What about the task for the picture description? Well, there with Edexcel, you have got the actual required elements they have to address. There are teacher prompts there, whereas it's totally free response. There are no teacher prompts for AQA. The students can just cover whatever they want. And then you have the examiner flexibility of question choice for the follow-up questions. Well, there for AQA, there's total freedom for the examiner to ask the questions, whereas with the Edexcel you've got 2 compulsory, 1 adaptable and the rest free choice. And this is really, I suppose, to balance the fact that there were only 2 questions in the read aloud follow-up. So in the end, I think it all balances out, doesn't it? There's the AQA photo card for foundation. So you can see they're drawing attention to the fact this is the theme of people and lifestyle, the hope and you look at this for all of them. I really do feel thought has gone into providing pictures which mean that students are going to be able to identify with these pictures. So there you've got a man and his child in a kitchen preparing food, and then you've got, I suppose, probably a family of 4 out playing football. The question always starts with, tell me about the photos, and they will know that for every single one they're going to have that. And then afterwards the teacher is reminded what the topics are within people and lifestyle, so identity and relationship with others, healthy living, education and work. And you can't see it on this slide, but within the specification there's quite a lot of guidance as to how you can best ask questions to be able to get the best out of the students. That so often at the beginning of a specification, I think people can be concerned about how can I as the examiner get the best marks. If you're familiar with AQA, then everything that you read there you'll be familiar with as well, because it's the sort of thing which has come out in exam reports, in examiner reports, saying, look, it really is down to the teacher sometimes to make sure that they can hit the highest grades, or rather the highest scores. So there we have the criteria. You can see it's, I think, quite helpfully split up into the different elements. So first of all, there's a grid for the description of the photo, so that's separate from the discussion. In the draft they lumped it all together, which I didn't think was quite as helpful, so I think it's good that it's now changed to this. So for the first bit, the response is to do with how much information you communicate and how clear it is. Again, those terms are defined there. That's 5 for, and AO2 is the bit where you're not interacting with anyone, you're just preparing what you know what you're going to say. Then you've got the here are the criteria then, where you can see that there's a separation between the criteria for describing the picture, so that's AO2, that's have nothing to do with listening to anything and responding. Then you've got a separate criteria for the interaction, the conversation, that's AO1. And the AO3 element, the grammar, only goes with the discussion. There's no AO3 at all with the description of the photo. That can be done purely by communication, nothing to do with the level of grammar used. We're now getting familiar with this, where things are really defined. So for the description of the photo, it's to do with clarity and messages being communicated, and that is explained there. And really helpfully, when it comes to the conversation, it's defining what does it mean: good development, minimal development, limited response, etc. So that again is, you're going to be able to prepare students to say how many, and it really comes down to the number of verbs which you need to be able to give in your answer. So here for foundation, good development is bringing in two verbs. The AO3 then for the grammar, as I say, only related to the conversation, where it's to do with variety of vocabulary and the number of errors that would be there. And within the specification, you will have definitions for major and minor errors. Here's the Edexcel picture card. Here then the students have a choice of either that one or that one. They are told what they must cover. They have to talk about the people, location, activity. It isn't open to them as to what they want to talk about. And then they will have 2 compulsory questions, and the teacher is told what sort of question they have to ask as the first one before they go on to any questions they like. So the difference here then, the fact that they have to cover these topics, these particular elements, the teacher is allowed to prompt. So if they haven't talked about the people, they can just prompt by saying et les personnes, and the people. If they haven't talked about the location, c'est où, so it's giving them some support there, but the criteria means they have to cover those things. Then as far as the compulsory questions, the questions will depend on which one they've chosen, And they're fairly straightforward, and they're always in the present tense, and it's to do with their preferences. What's your favourite food? What do you like to do at the house? They have to be asked in that way. And then there's a follow-on conversation on that broad thematic context. But for Edexcel, you are told what you must do as your starting question. You're not told exactly what the question must be, how it's formulated, but it must be, in this case, it must start to talk about regular activities. And that happens with all of the examples, 2 compulsory, and then 1 saying it's got to be on this topic, and then you can ask any questions you like. However, there is guidance to the teacher, just I suppose to remind them about what they've got to do in order to get those higher marks. So what did you do for your birthday last year? What are you going to do next weekend? For the higher level, both AQA and Edexcel use the same pictures for the foundation for the higher. But for the Edexcel, obviously the questions which relate will be different in the higher. So here the pattern here is, what do you like doing at the house, which is the same question as one of the ones for the foundation. That's, if you like, the overlap one. But then the additional question will be in the past tense. What did you eat yesterday evening, or what did you do on your mobile phone yesterday? So there is a certain predictability there. Excel criteria. They've got 3 sections, haven't they? Because first of all, they've got the description of the picture. They've then got the answer to the 2 compulsory questions to the picture, and then they've got the general conversation. So what they've gone for there is making it so for the description of the picture, it's not just communication, but it's also a place where you can pick up 4 marks for your grammar. So they're, in a way, I suppose, putting a little bit more emphasis on the description of the picture. A question which is probably, of all of them, the most predictable. They always know they're going to get a question on that. So you wonder whether in the end that's going to discriminate as much, because I think a lot of teachers are going to invest quite a lot of time in making sure that when you've got the picture, this would be sensible, wouldn't it? When you've got the picture, that's the point at which you're really going to try and get a variety of vocabulary and grammar as well. So that's for the description. The bit that's less predictable here, those 2 compulsory questions where the teacher can't rephrase it, that's the one where they're going for communication only. So I think that takes the pressure off. You're not having to think so much about the grammar. If you manage to communicate those 2 questions, you'll be rewarded for that. And then when it comes to the conversation, that's where you've got the again, the communication, if you like, or the interaction for AO1, and then you've got 4 marks for the AO3. And with all of these, you'll find that in the specification, this is all defined. So I think lots of it all balances out in the end, but you can see that, you know, the idea from AQA, I think, has been, let's really reduce the amount on the grammatical side, because when you're doing a speaking test, communication is the most important thing. You're not looking for that. AQA seem to have given a little bit more to the AO3. So they've got more marks there. But of those marks, the most predictable one is that describing the bit. I haven't done a screenshot of the higher level criteria, but it's exactly the same principle, so have a look at that separately. Something else that I've done, as I did for listening and reading, is to see to what extent is culture mentioned. Actually, in the end, I think this is quite telling that with neither of them are they going to be disadvantaged, or is it particularly thinking about the culture, because they're talking about themselves. The whole thing on a speaking test is making it so they are capable of speaking as themselves. So the main difference here you'll find with the between them is AQA, as I've already said, is an informality of you're talking to your French friend, your Canadian friend. And then you've got the normal topics. And when you come to the photo card, definitely I feel there has been a consideration in making sure that the photos represent a range of people in society. Little things you might want to look at, though, looking at the questions when there are compulsory questions. just checking that it doesn't exclude certain people. So for example, if there is a question about how you celebrate your birthday and you know that certain people don't ever on principle celebrate birthdays, it may be that you put in a request to change that particular card when it comes to the sequencing of it. And there it's the same for the Edexcel, in that it is talking from their point of view, but a big difference, as I've already said, is that because it's a formal context, you're preparing them for being able to operate abroad in situations that they may not well have come across before. But the important thing is that they do know that this is what's going to come up, so you will deliberately train them, which I'm sure we all do anyway. It's just whether or not you want to have that to be tested, but it is within Switzerland or within France, so the context is given in an authentic way. And there's the grid for higher, and there's the grid for higher for Edexcel.